A thin curl of smoke rose from the dugout's chimney pipe, and Amos Deverell reined his horse hard around at the sight of it, certain that no smoke that pale and desperate could mean anything but trouble. He had been riding the north line since dawn, checking fence where a windstorm had flattened 200 yards of it the week before, and he might have ridden right past the old Handley claim without a second glance. It had sat abandoned for a year, since the bachelor who'd proved it up had given up on the dry ground and moved on. Except that smoke did not rise from empty dugouts, and the sight of it, thin and grey against the white autumn sky, put a cold, urgent feeling in his chest that he did not stop to examine. He put his horse into a lope across the open plains, the grass gone brittle and gold with the first hard frosts of the season, and as he drew nearer he saw what he had not been able to see from the ridge, a woman on her knees in the dirt outside the half-collapsed dugout, digging with her bare hands at the base of a scraggly clump of wild licorice root, and beside her, two small children, a boy and a girl who could not have been more than 5, sitting listless and hollow-eyed in the cold, watching their mother dig. Amos swung down before his horse had fully stopped and crossed the last of the distance at a run. "Ma'am," he said, and the woman startled up so fast she nearly toppled, one arm flying instinctively across the children behind her, a fistful of dirt-caked roots still clutched in her other hand. He stopped himself short, hands raised, seeing the fear in her face plain as day. "I mean you no harm. I'm Amos Deverell. I run cattle on the range north of here. I saw your smoke." The woman did not lower her arm. She was young, or had been young not so long ago, hollowed by hunger into something older, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had clearly not eaten a full meal in longer than was safe, her hands scraped raw from digging in half-frozen dirt. But her eyes, when they finally settled on him and stopped measuring him for danger, were sharp and unbroken, a woman who had not yet let circumstance beat the fight out of her. "We're not trespassing with intent to stay," she said, quick and defensive. "I know this claim's abandoned. We'll be gone by morning if that's what you've come to say." "That's not what I've come to say." Amos looked past her to the two children, and something in his chest, long dormant, twisted hard. The boy's lips had a bluish cast to them that he did not like the look of at all, and the girl was shivering in a coat 2 sizes too small, clutched around her thin shoulders. "Those your children?" "Mine," the woman said, chin lifting even as she swayed slightly on her knees. "Toby and Grace. I'm Ruth Calloway. My husband died of the fever last spring, back east of Ellsworth, and I sold what little we had to bring us out here on the promise of a homestead claim that turned out to already be filed by another man by the time we arrived. We've been," her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together, unwilling, Amos understood, to let him see the whole shape of what those words meant. "We've been managing." Managing, he thought, looking at the collapsed dugout roof, the dead cook fire, the pale roots she had been grubbing out of frozen ground, because there was nothing else left to eat. Managing was not the word for it. But he recognized in the proud set of her jaw a woman who would rather starve than admit she was starving, and he knew better than to argue the point directly. "There's frost coming hard tonight," he said instead. "I felt it in the wind an hour back. This dugout won't hold heat with that roof half caved, and I don't expect you've got enough wood laid in to see morning even if it did." He crouched down slowly, unthreatening, to be nearer the children's eye level, and the boy watched him with the flat, careful eyes of a child who had learned not to hope for much. "I've got a ranch house 4 miles north with more rooms standing empty than I know what to do with, and a cook who'll have supper on directly. I'd be obliged if you'd let me carry you there before dark, ma'am. Just for the night, if that's all you'll accept, but I won't ride off and leave 2 children to a hard frost in a roof that's already fallen in on one side." Ruth Calloway looked at him a long moment, pride warring visibly with the plain fact of her children's blue-tinged lips. And Amos watched the pride lose, as he had known it eventually would, because no mother worth the name could choose her own dignity over her child's safety once it came down to a night like the one coming. "Just for the night," she said, though her voice shook on it. "We'll find our own way after that." "Just for the night," Amos agreed, though even as he said it he suspected, watching little Grace's teeth chatter, that one night was not going to be the end of this. He loaded them into the wagon he'd left hitched a half-mile back, near the fence line, wrapping the children in his own coat and the blanket from behind the seat, and Ruth sat rigid and watchful beside him the whole ride north, answering his careful questions in short, guarded sentences, offering nothing more of her story than the plain facts required. He did not press. He had learned over 8 lonely years running the ranch alone since his own young wife had died before they'd managed to have children of their own, that people told you what they were ready to tell you, and that pushing only closed doors that patience might eventually open. His cook, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Odessa who had kept his house running since before his wife passed, took one look at the children when they came through the door and did not wait for instruction. She had them wrapped in quilts and settled by the stove within minutes, a pot of broth warming, her sharp eyes cutting once toward Amos with a question in them that he answered with a small shake of his head. Not now, he meant, and Odessa, understanding, asked nothing aloud. Ruth ate carefully that first night, in small controlled bites that told Amos she had trained herself, out of necessity, not to eat too fast even when starving, a habit that told its own quiet story of a body's cruel bargains. The children, once warm and fed, fell asleep sitting upright at the table, and Amos carried each of them to bed himself, careful and clumsy with the unfamiliar weight of a sleeping child, while Ruth watched from the doorway with an expression he could not quite read, something between gratitude and a fierce, wary reluctance to let herself feel it too deeply. "You've been kind," she told him afterward, standing in his kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself. "And I don't know how to repay kindness like this. I've got nothing to offer you. No money, no land, nothing but 2 children and a debt of gratitude I can't pay. I didn't do it for repayment," Amos said, a little gruffly uncomfortable, as he often was with being thanked. Man rides past 2 children freezing in a collapsed dugout and does nothing. That man's not worth much as a man. I'd hope anybody in this county would have done the same. Not everybody would, Ruth said, quiet and certain, and something in the flat conviction of it told him she had already tested that particular hope and found it wanting, more than once, on the long road that had brought her here. She meant to leave the next morning. She said so plainly at breakfast, thanking Odessa for the meal, gathering the children's few belongings, already rehearsing, Amos suspected, the walk back to whatever remained of the collapsed dugout and the roots still frozen in the ground. It was Odessa, in the end, who talked sense into both of them, cornering Amos in the barn while Ruth dressed the children. "You mean to let that woman walk 4 miles back to a caved-in dugout with 2 babies, into a winter that's already killed grown men on this range?" Odessa demanded, hands on her hips. "Amos Deverell, I've known you since you were knee-high to your own father, and I know you've got more sense than that rattling around in your skull, even if you keep it well hid most days." "I can't just." Amos started and stopped because he did not, in fact, have a good reason ready for why he couldn't, only a vague and cowardly reluctance to examine why the thought of Ruth Calloway walking back out of his life within the hour had settled like a stone in his chest. "You've got rooms standing empty," Odessa said, softening slightly, seeing something in his face she recognized. "You've got more cattle and more land than one lonely man needs managing on his own. And don't think I haven't noticed you've been lonelier than a man ought to be for longer than I like to watch. That woman's not asking for charity, Amos, whatever pride makes her say. She's a hard worker, anybody can see it just watching her hands. Offer her honest work instead of charity. Let her earn her keep instead of accepting a gift. Might be she says yes to that, when she'd never say yes to pity." It was, Amos reflected, exactly the kind of plain good sense he ought to have thought of himself. And he found Ruth in the kitchen a few minutes later, the children already bundled for the walk she had promised to make. "I'd like to offer you work," he said, before he could talk himself out of it, before pride, his or hers, could get in the way of practical sense. Odessa's getting on in years, and the house is more than she can manage alone with the hands to cook for besides. "I need someone reliable in the kitchen and about the house, and I'll pay a fair wage same as I'd pay any hand. There's a room off the kitchen would suit you and the children better than a bunkhouse. It's honest work for honest pay, Mrs. Calloway. Nothing more asked of you than that." Ruth's chin lifted, and for a moment Amos she meant to refuse out of pure stubborn pride, until her eyes went to Toby and Grace, watching her with the same hollow, hopeful eyes they'd worn at the dugout, and something in her resolve visibly softened. "I'll take the work," she said. "And I'll earn it, Mr. Deverell. I don't take charity easy. But I know the value of a fair wage, and I'll give you an honest day's labor for it." I don't doubt it, Amos said, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he was smiling, an expression that did not come naturally or often to his weathered face, but that seemed, somehow, to fit easily enough around Ruth Calloway and her two watchful children. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Amos with how quickly it came to feel less like an arrangement and more like a household. Ruth proved as capable as Odessa had promised, quick with the mending, patient with temperamental cookstove, firm and gentle with Toby and Grace in a way that told Amos she had held that little family together through worse hardships than a hard winter, through sheer force of will and love. The children, once the hollow look left their eyes and color came back into their cheeks, revealed themselves to be a lively, curious pair, forever underfoot, forever finding new corners of the ranch to explore, and Amos found himself, more evenings than he would have admitted to a living soul, looking forward to Toby's earnest questions about cattle brands or Grace's solemn presentation of whatever small treasure, a smooth stone, a blue jay feather, she had found that day. There were quiet moments, too, that Amos found himself turning over long after they had passed. An evening when Toby, working up his courage over supper, finally asked whether Amos might teach him to sit a horse the way real cowans did, and Amos, gruffly pleased, had spent the following Sunday afternoon leading the boy at a slow walk around the near pasture, one hand steady on the saddle horn, while Grace perched on the fence cheering her brother on as though he'd already won a rodeo. Or the night a coyote's howl close by the house had sent Grace, frightened, padding barefoot into the kitchen, where Amos still sat mending a bridle by lamplight. And how she had climbed without hesitation into his lap and fallen back asleep there within minutes, trusting him utterly in a way that had undone something long guarded in his chest. Ruth, finding them there together in the morning, had said nothing, only smiled in a way that told him she had noticed exactly how far he had come from the careful, solitary man who had first carried two frightened children into his kitchen. It was not all easy. Some of the hands grumbled quietly at first about a woman and children underfoot on a working cattle ranch, though the grumbling faded fast once they tasted Ruth's cooking and watched how hard she worked without complaint. A harder trouble came from Cyrus Wendell, who ran the spread adjoining Amos's northern range and had coveted that same stretch of land, including the old abandoned Handley claim where Amos had first found Roth, for the better part of 2 years, hoping to buy it cheap and add the water rights to his own holdings. Wendell had assumed the claim would sit empty and revert for the taking once its filing lapsed, and it galled him considerably to learn that Amos Deverell had, in effect, taken an interest in the woman squatting on it. "Heard you took in some drifter woman and her brats," Wendell said one afternoon, cornering Amos outside the feed store in Coldridge with the particular smugness of a man who enjoyed stirring trouble he could later disclaim. "Careful, Deverell. Folks talk about a bachelor keeping a young widow under his roof with no ring on it. Man in your position ought to think about his standing in this county." "My standing in this county," Amos said evenly, though something hard had settled behind his eyes, "isn't built on gossip, Wendell, and I'd thank you to mind your own range and let me mind mine." "Just looking out for a neighbor," Wendell said, smiling in a way that suggested the opposite entirely, and rode off, leaving the threat of it hanging in the cold air. The gossip, once loosed, proved harder to outrun than Amos expected. It reached Ruth within the week, carried by a well-meaning but indiscreet farm wife at the mercantile, and it struck at exactly the old wound Amos had not known she carried, the fear worn deep from a lifetime of being judged for circumstances outside her control, that respectable people would always, eventually, find a reason to look down on her. "They think I've traded myself for a roof over my children's heads," she told Amos that evening, her voice tight with a hurt she was clearly trying hard to keep contained. "That I'm no better than—" She stopped herself, jaw working, and turned away toward the window rather than finish the thought. "You're not obliged to care what small-minded gossips think," Amos said, though he understood, even as he said it, that the words offered less comfort than he wished could. "I know that," Ruth said, turning back to face him, something fierce and wounded in her expression. "I've known it my whole life, Amos, and I've paid for that knowledge every single time regardless. It doesn't stop it from hurting. It doesn't stop it from following my children into whatever schoolyard they eventually attend. being called names for what their mother supposedly did to earn her keep. Amos crossed the kitchen to stand nearer her, close enough that she had to tip her face up to hold his eyes, and found himself, for once not searching for careful, guarded words but simply saying what sat plain and true in his chest. "Then let's give them nothing to gossip about," he said, low. "Marry me, Ruth. Not to silence Wendell, though I won't pretend that wouldn't be a fine side benefit. Marry me because these weeks with you and the children in this house have shown me what I'd forgotten a home could feel like, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending I don't feel it." Ruth stared at him, clearly startled past speech, for a long moment. "Amos, you don't have to rescue me twice over. Taking us in was already more than—" "This isn't rescue," Amos said firmly. "I'm not offering you a roof this time. I'm offering you my whole life, if you'll have it, and I'm asking for nothing back but the chance to spend the rest of my days watching Toby grow into a fine rancher and Grace grow into whatever she pleases, and loving their mother as much as I already do, whether or not you say yes tonight." For a long moment Ruth said nothing at all, and Amos, watching her face, began to fear he had moved too fast, pushed too hard against a pride and caution that had kept her and her children alive through hardships he could only guess at. Then her eyes filled and she laughed, a startled, watery sound, half sob, and pressed her palm to his chest as if to steady herself. "I came to this county with nothing," she said, "digging roots out of frozen ground to keep my children breathing another day, and now a good man is asking to marry me in his own kitchen. I'd be a fool to say no out of pride I can no longer afford. Amos Deverell. Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, careful and warm, the first time either of them had allowed themselves that particular tenderness, and from the hallway came a small, delighted gasp. Grace, who had crept down for water and witnessed the whole thing, and who announced the news to her brother at a volume that carried clear through the house, and brought Odessa hurrying in from the kitchen, already wiping happy tears on her apron. Cyrus Wendell did not take the news of the coming marriage gracefully. Within days he had begun pressing his old claim on the Handley land through the county recorder, arguing that Ruth's brief occupation of the abandoned dugout constituted no legal improvement, and that the claim should revert to open filing, which he intended to snap up the moment it did. Along with the water rights he had wanted from the start, it mattered little to Amos's own holdings. He had no interest in the claim itself, but it mattered a great deal to Ruth, who had begun, in her quiet way, to speak of someday proving up land of her own for Toby and Grace to inherit. And Wendell's maneuvering felt, to both of them, like one more attempt to erase the little foothold she had fought so hard to keep. Matters came to a dangerous head on a night in late November, when an early blizzard rolled down off the mountains faster and harder than the weather signs had promised, catching half of Amos's cattle still scattered on the open range and, worse, catching Wendell's own hired men out checking a boundary fence he had no business checking after dark. A fence that ran, as it happened, along the disputed edge of the old Handley claim, in weather that turned killing cold within the hour. It was Toby, restless and unable to sleep with the wind howling around the house, who spotted a lantern light struggling and failing far out on the white plain. And it was Ruth, roused by his frightened shout, who recognized with a cold lurch of memory exactly how fast that kind of cold could take a life, having nearly lost her own children to gentler cold than this. "Someone's out there," she said, already pulling on her coat before Amos had fully understood what she meant. "Amos, someone's caught out in this." He did not waste time arguing that it was too dangerous for her to come. He had learned in the weeks since the fire-lit night he'd first her fight for her children's lives, that Ruth Calloway did not stay behind when someone needed saving, and there was no time to debate it now. They rode out together into the screaming wind, Amos breaking trail on his sturdiest horse, Ruth close behind with lanterns and blankets lashed to her saddle, following the faint, failing light Toby had spotted until they found Wendell's hand, a young man named Sully, no older than 20, collapsed against his own horse's flank, half buried already in drifting snow, his hands too frozen to manage the reins any longer. They got him up between them, Amos hauling the dead weight of him onto his own horse, while Ruth blankets tight and fast with the same sure, practiced hands that had once dug roots from frozen ground to keep her own children alive, and they fought their way back through the blinding white toward the ranch house. Ruth's voice raised steady and calm against the wind the whole way, keeping the half-conscious young man talking. Keeping him awake, keeping him alive by main force of will when his body wanted only to sleep in the killing cold. They got him to the house with perhaps an hour to spare before the cold would have finished what it started. Odessa and Amos worked the frost from Sully's hands and feet through the rest of the night, Ruth never leaving his side, and by dawn, exhausted and grey but breathing steady, the young man opened his eyes and understood, plain as anything, precisely whose hands had pulled him back from the edge. Cyrus Wendell arrived at the ranch house at first light, wild with worry over his missing hand, and found Sully alive and mending in Amos Deverell's own bed, nursed through the worst of the night by the very woman whose claim he had spent weeks trying to steal out from under her. Something in Wendell's hard, calculating face broke open at the sight of it, shame perhaps, or simply the plain, undeniable evidence of a decency he had tried to dismiss as gossip fodder. "I owe you an apology," Wendell said stiffly to Ruth, unused plainly to the shape of those words in his own mouth. "And I expect I owe you one too, Deverell, for the trouble I've caused chasing that claim. I'll withdraw my filing dispute. Land's not worth what it cost my own man's life to nearly lose over it." "See that you do," Amos said, but there was no real heat left in it, only the tired relief of a night survived. Ruth, for her part, said nothing at all. Only reached out and touched Sully's frost-reddened hand where it lay on the quilt, a gesture of plain, unadorned kindness that told the whole county, once word of the night's rescue spread, everything it needed to know about the character of the woman Cyrus Wendell had tried to paint as a schemer. They were married the following spring, once the passes cleared and Ruth's sister could travel in from the east to stand witness, in a ceremony held right there in the ranch house parlor with wildflowers gathered by Grace's own small, careful hands and Toby standing solemn and proud beside Amos, as if he already understood himself to be gaining a father in more than name. Odessa cried through the whole service, and would not be persuaded otherwise, and Sully, fully recovered, stood at the back with the other hands, having become in the months since the blizzard, something like a devoted younger brother to the family that had saved his life. That first summer as husband and wife, Amos built a second room onto the house without being asked, filling it with a proper bed for Toby and a smaller one for Grace, and watched with a satisfaction that never seemed to dim as the two children who had once sat hollow-eyed beside a dying dugout fire grew sturdy and brown and loud with the particular joy of children who no longer had cause to be afraid. "Do you remember," Ruth asked him one evening, the two of them walking the fence line at dusk with the children racing ahead through grass gone gold in the last light, "what you said to me that first night when I told you we'd be gone by morning?" "I remember," Amos said. "I told you I didn't expect one night was going to be the end of it." "You were right," Ruth said, slipping her hand into his, though I don't think either of us understood, that first night, just how much more than one night it was going to be. He stopped and turned to her, the children's laughter carrying back to them on the evening wind, the ranch house glowing warm and lit behind them against the coming dark, and thought that he had ridden out that autumn morning chasing nothing more than a thin curl of smoke against a white sky, never once suspecting it would lead him in the end to the hole of his heart. "Best smoke I ever chased," he said, and kissed her, and did not let go for a long while. Later, when the children had been called in for supper and the first stars had begun to prick through the fading blue overhead, Ruth paused at the porch step and looked back once at the wide, gold-lit plain that had so nearly been the death of her small family and had instead become, against every fear she had carried west with her, the ground on which they had finally built a home. She thought of the frozen roots, the collapsed roof, the two children she had once believed she might not manage to keep alive through a single hard winter, and she thought that if she could reach back across that terrible morning and tell her frightened, digging self one true thing, it would be simply this: that the smoke she had lit in desperation, never once imagining it might be seen, had been the very thing that saved them all. She went into supper with her husband's hand warm in hers, and did not look back at the plain again, needing at last to look only forward.